Good afternoon and welcome back everybody. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. But it's time to go again, so with no further ado, I would like to welcome to the stage Adam Blake.
Hello. Oh, everybody. Great. So today I'm going to be talking about cybersecurity within hospitality, specifically talking through a recent security breach. So just a quick introduction for who I am. So I used to work for the Big Four consulting companies as a security consultant. And back in 2011, I started my own company, ThreatSpike. And the idea really behind that was trying to help companies to get a better handle on cybersecurity. So as a consultant, what I often noticed is that the kind of customers that I would be working with, these were really high-end financial services companies. They had huge amounts of money to spend on cybersecurity, but they were still doing quite a bad job of it. And I think part of that was caused by the vendors letting them down, not supplying them with good technology, not supplying them with help and services to support them in getting value out of those technologies. And so I saw a great opportunity in the market to kind of make a real difference. And so over time, we've kind of stopped working with actually really large companies like that, and we now focus on the kind of the small, medium-sized enterprises. ThreatSpike now, so as I mentioned, we started the company in 2011. Now, ThreatSpike is a truly global company, so we service around about 400 customers across 80 countries. We have subsidiaries all over the world, helping customers locally with their cybersecurity needs. So what I wanted to talk about today is to actually run through an example of a cybersecurity breach, okay? Now, for anybody who's actually been in a situation where they've had to handle a security breach before, you know it can get really uncomfortable really quickly. But I just kind of want to walk through an example with you and kind of show you just how quickly things go badly. So to take an example, this is actually a really relevant example. So this actually happened just a couple of weeks ago on the Palm Jumeirah, of all places. It's 11 o'clock at night. So one thing to really pay attention to here is that the bad guys, they always wait until it's really late in the time zone in which they're hacking into. So in this case, it was 11 o'clock in Dubai, and there was an F&B terminal, in a restaurant, where suddenly like it kind of came active, okay? And what it was actually happening there is that an attacker was actually connecting in to that terminal through AnyDesk, which happened to be installed on the machine. And so as soon as that attacker actually connected onto the machine, they were presented with what was already on the screen from the last person who used the terminal. And actually it was the Opera Cloud website, which was loaded inside of the browser. And the user on that machine had actually stored the password for Opera Cloud on the browser. So it automatically kind of like populated the username and password for them, which is obviously like a lot of people might do this for convenience. But the thing is that it's interesting because the attacker connected directly onto that machine, and within the first minute, they were able to actually extract that password from the browser. It's really easy to do. You can just open up the debugger tools on the browser. You can click on the network tab and you can hit the submit button, and you can actually see in the request exactly what username and password is being submitted to the site. It's simple. Now, if you're thinking that MFA would protect you in this case, the thing is that when you log in, you're given a session cookie, and you can do exactly the same kind of thing with a session cookie. You can actually take these details, you can copy them out of the AnyDesk session, you can put them into a machine outside of that hotel network, and you can access Opera Cloud as though you were accessing it from within the hotel. This is all within the first minute. So the time is at the top right, so give you kind of an idea of how quickly these things happen. So with access into Opera Cloud, they can obviously then get access to information about who's staying in the hotel, PII data. They can then dump this outside of the hotel. All of this is being done very, very quickly. Now, it's quite interesting because the user account itself on the machine was a generic account. And that generic account was actually also a local administrator on the machine. Another practice which isn't particularly good practice. And what you can actually do is in Windows, not to go too technical into this, but there's a process called LSAS. And essentially this process is what keeps all of the secret information about what username and passwords there are. It's a very heavily protected process, but inside of it, it has all of those kind of username and passwords which have been cached on the machine. So you would expect it to have whoever's logged into that machine recently, it would hold on to their details. And so what the attacker actually did in this case, and we're 5 minutes into the attack, is they actually opened up Task Manager. They scrolled through the list of processes, they found LSAS, and because they were a local administrator on the machine, they were actually able to do what's called create a memory dump of it. So they essentially take that really sensitive process and they just write a copy of its memory to disk. And so once they've done that, they can actually look through the memory of the process that's been dumped, and they can find all of either the passwords themselves or at least the hashes of all the passwords. And so the problem is that there had actually been a domain administrator, so maybe the IT manager, who had logged onto this machine using that account recently, and his password, or the hash of his password, was actually stored inside LSAS, and it got dumped to disk. So within 5 minutes, they actually had access to the domain administrator account. So then from here, they were then actually able to then move on to essentially their final goal. So what they're looking to do here is to ransom the network. And so they were able, with the actual domain administrator credentials, they were able to connect across onto the domain controller within the network. They were then able to create a group policy object, so a GPO, and use this GPO to actually run essentially a program across the entire network, across all of the machines, telling those local machines to encrypt the local files on the disk, but also, whilst doing it, to upload copies of these files to a DigitalOcean server, okay? And the idea of this is that the ransomware actors, they take a kind of a multi-pronged approach to this. So not only do they encrypt your files and then threaten you, but essentially what they'll actually do is take a copy of all the files as well. They'll exfiltrate them from the network. They'll store them on their side so that they can then actually threaten you if you refuse to make payment. So if you're thinking, I'm just going to revert back to a backup and get my files back, the problem is that they can then actually threaten you and say, look, we'll release the copy of all your files if you don't pay the ransom. So they were able to do this. Again, we're only 8 minutes into this attack. And at this point, they then pushed a ransom note out across the entire network. And so this ransom note appears on all the desktops in the network, on all the machines. So somebody would come in the morning, or it could be people obviously working the night shift, who would then see these messages appearing on the screen saying, your files are encrypted, you need to pay money into our Bitcoin wallet, and then we'll give you access to your files back. So you can see that these things happen really quickly, and I think this is something that it catches people off guard a little bit. People think that these things, I think like going back in the day, it used to be this concept of like ransomware attacks took days and days of somebody being inside the network to pull these kind of attacks off. But the people who attack nowadays, they are really well practiced. They can do this stuff very, very quickly. I mean, they literally go from company to company to company doing exactly the same thing. So 15 minutes, 30 minutes is more than realistic to pull off a ransomware attack nowadays. And so everything was kind of aligned for them in this case. And then finally, an hour and a half later, a post is made on the ransomware actor's website saying that this hotel has actually been their victim, and that if payment isn't made, then they're going to be releasing a copy of all the files. And so obviously this is a pretty devastating thing to come into, to see that your company name is listed on a public website, and that people are obviously threatening you, and they want you to pay them. It's impossible to come back from this point, because essentially your reputation is ruined, because this information will be everywhere. And so I think one of the common questions that people ask themselves at this point is, how does the AnyDesk access even happen in the first place? Okay, and you know, the attacker was able to connect onto AnyDesk. So how did they actually get that access? How did they know the login details? And I think for most people, this bit remains a bit of a mystery. Okay, attribution is incredibly hard, and a lot of people want answers in these cases. So you'll have the CEO of the company who will be asking, you know, who was it? Where was the IP address? You know, where was this person located who just encrypted our network? And the answer is that it's almost impossible to actually tell. You have to spend an incredible amount of time, and because there's multiple legal jurisdictions and things like this, and people are not just going to hand out the data and the information about who purchased this DigitalOcean server. And even if they did, unfortunately, it gets paid for through stolen credit card numbers and things like this, which they got from other attacks. So it's actually typically impossible to actually find out how these details got leaked. But interestingly, we actually had a case a few years ago where, based on the user account that was actually used in the attack, it was very obvious which company had been using that user account. And so actually they gave us permission to go and investigate on their side. So we got access to their machines and we got to carry out an investigation. And what we found is that when we looked through their actual activity on their machine, we carried out forensics, we found that an employee had downloaded some cracked software. So this was one of their, I think, software developers who had been working on a project. They would connect in and ultimately they download some cracked software. So they got what they wanted, but in the background, that software actually came bundled with what's called an info stealer. And the info stealer, it takes a whole collection of different information. So it'll go through all your passwords that are stored in your browsers, it'll go through your cookies, it will take screenshots of what's happening on your machine, and it will upload all of this information to a hacker's server. And the problem thing is typically the person who actually ran the software has no idea that it's even happened. So this often happens, okay? And there are many ways that IT people get targeted. So cracked software is one of them. And the other typical thing is that if you actually Google for like Windows error codes which come up, so if you're trying to install a patch or something like this and it doesn't work, then what you'll get is all these help desk articles and YouTube videos and things like this. Now, interestingly, a lot of these have actually been booby-trapped. They're essentially being poisoned. And what the attackers do is they create fake articles where they put PowerShell scripts on, and there's an example here in the bottom right-hand corner. And this PowerShell script is actually a malicious PowerShell script. And the IT person just wanting to fix the problem that they have will just copy and paste this onto the machine, run it as an administrator, and again, it will capture all of the information from their system. So when an attack happens, it's important to think about like who would have used the AnyDesk in the first place. You know, and it could have been years ago, it could have been resident there for a long time. Was it an employee? Was it a supplier? Was it an ex-IT manager? Like who was it that was using AnyDesk before? And so it's very likely that they've been compromised. And then that access is then being used to access your network. And so one thing which a lot of people don't talk about, like when you talk about the typical advice that gets given for cybersecurity attacks, very little people talk about certain massive vulnerabilities which exist. And one of those is when employees sync their browsers to their personal accounts. Right, so they'll be sitting at their workstation, they'll be logged in, they'll be doing their job kind of thing. They'll be storing passwords in the browser for Opera Cloud and stuff like this, and AnyDesk and services like this. And what they'll do is they'll actually log into the browser using their personal Gmail account or something like this. And Google will actually copy all of the passwords on the corporate machine across onto the actual user's personal machine. And that personal machine is obviously outside your network, it's outside your control, it's outside your protection, you can't monitor it or anything like this. And Google introduced a similar vulnerability recently with Google Authenticator, so you can actually sync the two-factor codes as well. So those are also, if they're being synced to a personal device, then they are completely at risk. And so this was actually the entry point to one of the biggest cybersecurity attacks that happened, and it targeted Okta, the identity and access management company. So they had I think a support person who actually logged into his browser, and he had the master password to the support website, and that password synced onto his personal device. His personal device got hacked, and they gained access to the Okta support portal, and they were able to actually exfiltrate off customer passwords from the support portal, which customers had provided. And so it was a really, really bad hack. But interestingly, you never hear this kind of advice. You never hear advice like block employees from logging into browsers. It's a very simple piece of advice to heed, but it never gets provided. So there are really big gaping holes which enable these types of attacks to happen. So I guess the question is, is it game over, right? Are these attacks too hard to actually stop? And the good news is that, well, actually, no, okay? So this case that I walked through is an example of something that we've seen time and time again. But actually, luckily, in the case of this hotel, the attack was real, but 10 days before the hotel had been attacked, they actually had engaged our services to help us, to help them to secure their environment. So we were in the very early stages of onboarding them as a customer. So we had our software deployed into their network. We were monitoring their systems, and our software detected the initial access patterns of the AnyDesk access. And as the AnyDesk access kind of progressed, as the attacker connected into the network, we actually basically caught quite a lot of the activity that was happening. So this was when they were, for example, connecting. This was when they were trying to work out who the domain administrators were, what the domain controller was, things like this. Our software collected all this information. We correlated it on our side, and automatically the machine was sandboxed. And it was sandboxed at 11:05. So if you react really quickly to these types of attacks, then you can completely cut them off. There's no further access to the network. There's no further damage that can be caused, but you have to react really, really quickly. So we've done a lot in terms of looking at these kind of living on the land attacks, as they're called. So these are not attacks where necessarily somebody's kind of putting malware onto the machine, but this is where genuine administrator access is being used to hack customers, right? And so you have to ask yourself those questions. If somebody were to connect onto your network as an IT administrator, and we've seen attacks even from IT administrators' own home IP addresses, then would you be able to detect these types of attacks? And so in this case, we reacted very quickly to it. We were able to reset all the passwords. We were able to block AnyDesk across the entire network. We conducted forensics to understand the scope of the breach. And then we got the local IT team to rebuild the device. And so all of that was done very, very quickly, cutting the attack off at the source. And so using this kind of approach, we've actually had a 100% success rate against ransomware and actually any kind of other major breaches. And so this is something that we would always kind of recommend, that if because this customer was actually, they were only in detection, they were not in prevention, because essentially they'd only onboarded about 2 weeks before this type of attack. But this demonstrates that if you can disrupt attacks very quickly, then you stand a huge amount of success, rates of success in actually preventing these types of damages and ransomware attacks and things like this from happening. And so in our case, we actually as a company, we provide two main things. So one is our Threats by Blue service, which is actually all around security monitoring. So our philosophy is that customers shouldn't be buying lots of different security tools. So you find a lot of companies are buying email security, they're buying asset inventory, they're buying EDR, they're buying WAF, they're buying web filtering. They're buying two-factor solutions for PCI compliance and things like this. It's just a continuous buying process. And somebody ultimately at the end of the day has to support it, somebody has to monitor it. And so what we do instead is that we sign customers up onto a subscription, and we give them all of the security controls that they need. And when a new requirement comes out, so like as part of PCI 4 is a really good example, there was additional MFA required on end-user machines. We actually developed it, and then we pushed it out to our customers at no additional cost. And so we do that. We provide rapid response as part of a SOC service, and we provide instant response to help with these serious cases. And then we provide the other side, and this is what a lot of hotels are not doing at the moment. So through our Threat Spike Red service, this is around penetration testing. It's called offensive security. This is where you essentially attack yourselves in order to see how well you would perform in such a cyber attack. And so a lot of people will say that they do like PCI scans and things like this, but this is kind of very basic types of running a Nessus scan or a Qualys scan or something like this and getting some results out of it and trying to patch some holes. What you really need to be doing is red team exercises. And I'll go on to that into a second, what that includes. And so as part of our Threat Spike Blue service, what we're doing is we're installing endpoint agents onto machines. We're collecting events from cloud services to detect mailbox breaches. We're pulling in logs from on-prem sources like switches, firewalls, things like that. And then we're processing it outside. And we're keeping all that information for a year. We're analyzing it. And I think really importantly, is about 2 years ago, we moved from having an approach where somebody would actually have to, on our team, look at an incident, see that it's bad, sandbox a machine, to just a fully automated process. And so by reducing the response time down, you've got to be able to measure your response time in minutes, as you can see from this attack. Otherwise, it's just too late. And so as part of the security controls, you've got to be thinking about all these different types of controls. Are you detecting when employees are copying sensitive customer data into ChatGPT, for example? I think that's a really popular one at the moment. Do you have email protection in place? Do you have file integrity monitoring on your servers as part of PCI? Do you have your firewalling in place? Do you have network monitoring? Do you have MFA? What about on-prem Active Directory? How do you secure the Active Directory accounts of domain admins? How do you enforce that MFA requirement? And similarly kind of thing with things like VPNs. They're a huge target for ransomware attacks. And so people should be moving away from VPNs into kind of more modern solutions. Something where when a bad guy comes along and tries to scan the network, he can't find that entry point. He can't find where to concentrate his efforts. And so we find that our hotel customers, after a number of years, have actually made their way through a good 75% of these types of controls and roll them out across their entire portfolio. And the difference is astounding. But coming back to what we were talking about, the red team exercises, this is something which a lot of people don't do. I think it's been kind of out of the budget for a lot of hoteliers, but it's one of those, what we do as part of a red team exercise is we will actually act like the attacker. So we will look at who works for the company, who recently started, we'll call up employees, we'll send them phishing emails, we'll go physically on site, we will jump the counters, go in through secret, special doors, back entrances, we'll look for skeleton keys for the premises, and we will see exactly what we can do. And more often than not, when these attacks are pulled off, we will find a path where we're actually able to get access into the internal network, we're able to exfiltrate data, and we're able to elevate ourselves to domain admin and do a fake ransomware attack. And the thing is that once you know how this stuff would happen in real life, you can actually fix it proactively. And I think that's a really powerful thing. What you don't want to be doing is waiting until somebody attacks you to then find out how good your defenses are. So yeah, that's kind of the end of what I wanted to talk about. Did anybody have any questions about that? AI is opening us up to even further vulnerabilities. Any further discussion around this as it's being used on both sides? So, okay, so AI is definitely opening up further vulnerabilities. So on multiple sides. So we find, especially within hospitality, that there are a lot of people who are taking quite sensitive, I would say, customer data and copying it into AI services. And they're doing this for various different reasons. They're doing it to write performance reviews. They're doing it to understand what a customer's email means when it's, maybe English is not their first language. They're doing it to craft the emails. And so ultimately, putting guest information and PII data into these services is a big data privacy issue. Then from the other side, the phishing emails that hospitality receives are a whole nother level. So when we look across different verticals, because we protect everybody from private jet companies to airports to retailers, tech companies, hospitality, and hospitality is by far ground zero for phishing attacks. And so the variations in all the different types of phishing attacks, focusing on Agoda, Expedia, Booking.com, the multitude of different approaches, the fact that it changes every couple of days. And what we've been noticing is that definitely now, this year, that AI is definitely being used to write the emails, because you're starting to get kind of more elaborate ones. I mean, before it was kind of more very basic kind of thing, and sometimes broken English and stuff like this. And now you're starting to get these like fantastic phishing emails where you know that they've been written by ChatGPT. And so the thing is that essentially helps them to get through all the email filters. So if you're putting in manual filters to block on particular keywords and stuff like this, the problem is they're going to find another version of it tomorrow that's going to bypass your email filter. Now, AI is actually helping on the flip side, it's helping on the detection, because you can also use AI to recognize and break away from just signature detection into kind of more exotic form of detection. So for example, you can say, look at this email, are there any suspicious indicators of it? And it will be able to digest that natural language, and it will be able to get the context out, and then you can use that context in your detections as a security vendor. And so there's a lot more kind of obviously AI being used on the security side. So the other question, how does copying data to ChatGPT leave us vulnerable? So the thing is that in terms of it, like customers, when they come forward, you might be dealing with personal individuals, you might be dealing with businesses. A lot of time when you deal with businesses, you'll be signing NDAs. If you start taking data and you start uploading it into ChatGPT, for example, then you are breaking the NDA for sure. So there's that kind of corporate view. There's that view of breaking the trust and relationship between your customers. And also it breaks data privacy rules as well. So actually, interestingly, I think a lot of people are not really aware of how much data is actually flowing to these AI services. You've got Copilot, you've got ChatGPT, and obviously now in the last few weeks, people have been talking about like new Chinese AI engines. And so equally, your data could be being sent from your local network to Chinese servers to use their AI. And so it will typically, if you look into it, it will be violating the data privacy and protection laws, like especially like things like GDPR. And I would say that a lot of the hotels groups that we work with now, after they've actually seen the problem, they're now blocking it. So it's now working out for them, how can they safely expose these tools to their users? And I think a lot of people are now looking at Copilot as an answer to that kind of question, because they have that trust relationship with Microsoft. Microsoft's already processing their data. They're providing a solution that their user base can use instead of ChatGPT. But ChatGPT is just one of them. When you go to Google and you type ChatGPT and things like this, all kinds of different things come up. Not even legitimate ChatGPT, but there'll be other ones that people find, and they'll just be putting their data into there. So it's a massive risk. You need to be being very clear where your data is being sent. All right, I think that's the end of the questions. Thank you very much.